As you watch this video, kindly like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel so that whenever I post a new video, you'll be the first to be notified. The night it happened, the rain tapped gently against the windows, and the house was wrapped in an unsettling silence. Usually at this hour, I could still hear the soft hum of the television from Mr. Johnson's study or the clatter of dishes being washed in the kitchen. But that night, everything felt still.
Too still.
I was lying in my small room at the back of the house, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in my chest. My mother had called earlier, asking if I could send extra money for my sister's school fees. I had told her I'd try, but deep down, I knew my salary barely covered my own expenses. I sighed, rolling onto my side, hoping sleep would take me. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the staircase. My stomach tightened. Mr. Johnson had been drinking again. I could smell the whiskey from the hallway when I passed earlier. He always drank when Mrs. Linda was away on her business trips. But this time, something felt different. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped outside Mary's room. My breath caught in my throat. I crept to my door, cracked it open, and peered out into the dimly lit hallway. There he was, Mr. Johnson, his expensive robe hanging loosely around his broad frame, a glass of whiskey clutched in his hand. He swayed slightly, his eyes heavy with drink. He knocked lightly on Mary's door. "Mary," he called softly. "Open up, sweetheart." I gripped the edge of my door tightly. I could see the faint shadow of Mary moving inside her room. My heart pounded in my chest as I willed her not to open the door. But Mr. Johnson wasn't the kind of man you could ignore.
"Come on, Mary."
"I just want to talk," he coaxed, his voice dripping with false sweetness. There was a long pause. Then, slowly, the door creaked open just a little, and Mary's face appeared. She looked terrified. "Sir, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's late." He stepped closer, pushing the door open wider with his free hand. "Don't be scared, Mary. I'll take care of you." She took a step back, and that was all he needed. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. I stood frozen in the hallway, my whole body shaking. I wanted to do something, to shout, to knock, to stop him, but I didn't. I just stood there, paralyzed with fear and guilt. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The muffled sounds coming from Mary's room made my stomach churn. I pressed my hands against my ears, but it didn't help. I could still hear it. Eventually, the door opened again, and Mr. Johnson walked out, adjusting his robe, looking satisfied. He didn't see me watching from the shadows. He walked back to his room, humming under his breath like nothing had happened. I stood there for a long time, staring at Mary's closed door, feeling ashamed. I should have done something, but I didn't. The next morning, the house felt colder, quieter. The sunlight that usually poured in through the windows, casting soft shadows across the living room, seemed muted. There was no sound of Mary bustling about, getting ready for the day, humming under her breath like she usually did. No cheerful greetings or small talk. Just the heavy silence that hung in the air. I waited for her to come downstairs for breakfast, but she didn't. Normally, she was the first one up, preparing the table, making sure Mr. Johnson had everything he wanted before his day started. But that morning, she didn't come. I sat at the dining table, staring at the empty seat across from me, feeling a knot form in my stomach. Something was wrong. When I finally saw her, it was almost lunchtime. She appeared at the top of the stairs, her steps slow and deliberate. She wore the same faded apron she always wore, but today, it hung loosely on her frail frame, and her hair, usually neat and pulled back, was slightly disheveled. Her eyes were red, swollen, as if she had spent the night crying. "Mary?" I called gently, my voice barely above a whisper. She paused for a moment, her gaze flickering toward me. But she didn't respond. She just continued down the stairs, as if she hadn't heard me. I couldn't help but notice the stiffness in her posture, the way her shoulders were hunched as if she was carrying the weight of the world on them. She entered the kitchen without a word and began preparing the meal for Mr. Johnson, her hands moving mechanically, as if she were on autopilot. She didn't greet him, Didn't ask if he wanted anything special for breakfast. Didn't even acknowledge me when I walked in. I watched her for a while, trying to figure out what was wrong. Her usual enthusiasm for the work was gone. Her energy, usually so full of life, seemed drained from her. Mr. Johnson, seated at the dining table, barely looked up from his newspaper as Mary placed his plate in front of him. "More sugar," he muttered, as he usually did. Mary nodded and quickly walked back to the kitchen. She didn't say a word. I felt a pang of concern in my chest. Something was definitely off, but I didn't know what to do. I wanted to help, but I wasn't sure how. She wasn't the type to ask for help. As the morning wore on, I noticed the subtle changes in Mary's behavior. She spoke less, her movements slower, more deliberate. When she did speak, it was always in a soft, almost robotic voice, as if she wasn't really present, as if her mind was somewhere else entirely. I tried to make conversation with her, but she would give short, one-word answers or just nod in response. It was clear she didn't want to talk. I respected her silence, even though it ate at me. I wanted to reach out, to tell her that I was there for her, but something in her eyes told me that wasn't what she needed. Later in the day, I found her in the laundry room, sitting on the floor with her knees pulled to her chest, staring blankly at the wall. I stood in the doorway for a long time before I gathered the courage to approach her. "Mary," I said quietly. She didn't react at first, but when I spoke her name again, she slowly lifted her head. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean to worry you." "You didn't," I lied, sitting down beside her on the cold floor. "But you don't have to go through this alone." She didn't answer. Her eyes welled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away before I could see them. She forced a smile, but it was weak, forced. "I'm fine," she said, but it was clear she wasn't. I wanted to grab her, hold her, and tell her it was okay. That she didn't have to stay, that she didn't have to endure whatever it was she was going through. But the words stuck in my throat. I didn't know how to help her. All I could do was sit there beside her, silently, my heart breaking for her. She stayed in the laundry room for what felt like hours, and I stayed with her for as long as I could, not knowing what else to do. That evening, as I was cleaning the kitchen, I heard the familiar sound of Mr. Johnson's voice coming from the hallway. He was speaking to Mary. His tone was low, almost too sweet, but I could tell from the way she hesitated that she wasn't comfortable. "Mary," he said, his voice carrying through the hallway. "Come to my office. I need you for something." I froze, wiping my hands on a dish towel. I could hear Mary's quiet response, barely a whisper. "Yes, sir." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I knew what would happen next. I had seen this before. The late-night visits, the way Mr. Johnson would act like a completely different person when his wife was away. I had seen the subtle changes in the way he looked at Mary, the way he touched her arm, the way he lingered just a little too long. But I had never been able to do anything about it. I felt the anger bubbling up inside me. I wanted to go to her, to stop her, to tell her to run away. But I couldn't. The fear, the power he had over her, was too great. It was too dangerous. And I, like the others, stayed silent. I didn't know what happened behind closed doors. I couldn't hear the details, but I could imagine. I could picture it in my mind. The tension in the air, the way he must have looked at her, the words he might have said. When she returned to the kitchen a short while later, she was different. Her eyes were even more empty than before. She moved like a shadow, her steps slow, deliberate, as if she were walking through a fog. She didn't look at me when she walked past. She didn't say a word. I wanted to scream at her, to ask her what had happened, but I knew she wouldn't say. I knew that nothing would ever change. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. The silence in the house was deafening. I went through the motions, completing my tasks, but my mind was on Mary. What had she gone through in that room? What had he done to her this time? I couldn't stand it anymore. But I couldn't do anything. I was just another silent witness to her suffering. The days that followed Mary's silent withdrawal were agonizing. Every morning when I woke up, I half expected to see her standing in the kitchen, the sound of her cheerful humming filling the space, but each day I was met with the same hollow silence. She no longer arrived early to set the table, nor did she rush around in the kitchen to make sure everything was perfect for Mr. Johnson's breakfast. Her absence lingered like an oppressive fog, hanging over the house. On the third morning after the night in Mr. Johnson's office, I walked into the kitchen, hoping for some normalcy. Mary wasn't there. I stood in the doorway, staring at the empty space. The kitchen had never felt so cold, and it wasn't just because of the weather. I had come to rely on her presence, her constant movement and chatter, even if it was minimal. Now, with her gone, everything felt off-kilter. I tried to keep my focus on my own tasks, preparing breakfast, making the coffee, laying out the table, but my mind kept drifting back to Mary. Where was she? Why wasn't she here? Mr. Johnson came in shortly after, as usual. He didn't seem to notice the absence of Mary, or at least he didn't acknowledge it. He gave his customary gruff greeting and settled into his seat at the table. "Where is Mary?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. He glanced up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Why would you care?" he muttered, taking a sip from his cup. I felt my stomach twist with the question I hadn't dared to ask before. But now it was a burning need to know. "She hasn't come in today. She's probably taking a break," he answered dismissively, waving a hand as if it didn't matter. But there was something in his voice, a tightness, a defensiveness, that told me he wasn't as unconcerned as he tried to appear. I didn't press him further. The unease settled in me, like a stone in my chest. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened the night before, it had changed everything. By late afternoon, I finally saw her. She wasn't working in the kitchen or the living room, where I expected to find her. Instead, I found her in the garden, sitting on the stone bench near the flower beds, staring blankly ahead. Her back was stiff, her posture rigid, as if she were trying to hold herself together. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, fragile, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her. I approached quietly, not wanting to startle her. "Mary?" I called softly. She turned slowly to face me, her eyes empty, like the light in them had been extinguished.
"Oh,
"It's you," she said, her voice flat, devoid of the warmth I had grown used to. She didn't even try to smile. "Are you okay?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She wasn't. "I'm fine," she said quickly, her tone defensive, but the way she held herself told a different story. There was a dullness to her expression, as though she had given up fighting whatever demons were haunting her. I stood beside her for a moment, unsure of what to do. I wanted to wrap my arms around her, to tell her she didn't have to keep this secret, to reassure her that she wasn't alone. But she was already pulling away, putting up walls I couldn't climb. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, almost to herself, her voice shaking just slightly. "I can't stay here anymore. But I don't know where to go." My heart broke at the sight of her. She had been so strong when I first met her, full of life, always willing to help, always smiling. But now, she was a shell of that person. It was as if the man who had once been kind to her had slowly destroyed everything she was, piece by piece. "You can leave, Mary," I said, my voice a little more forceful than I intended. "You don't have to stay here. You don't owe him anything." She shook her head slowly. "I don't know where I would go. I don't have any family. I don't have a place to stay." And she trailed off, and for the first time, I saw something break in her eyes. The tears that had been threatening to spill finally did, but she quickly wiped them away. "And what if he comes after me? What if he—" I didn't let her finish. "He won't hurt you if you leave, Mary. You don't have to be afraid anymore." But the fear in her eyes didn't disappear. It was clear that she didn't trust herself to leave, to step outside the small cage she had been trapped in for so long. The power Mr. Johnson held over her was too great. It was in the way she flinched whenever he raised his voice, in the way she avoided looking him in the eye. She had been conditioned to believe she had no choice, that there was nowhere else to go. "You're not alone," I said softly, kneeling beside her. "You have me. I'll help you." For the first time in days, I saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. But it was fleeting, gone almost as quickly as it had appeared. That evening, after Mr. Johnson had retired to his study, I found Mary packing a small bag in her room. Her movements were rushed, frantic, like she was afraid someone would stop her, but I could see the desperation in her eyes, the way she hurried to fold her clothes, the way she grabbed her few possessions with trembling hands. "Mary," I called softly, stepping into the doorway. "Are you sure?" She looked at me, her face pale, the dark circles under her eyes standing out. "I can't stay here anymore," she whispered, tears welling up again. "I have to leave." My heart twisted. "Where will you go?" "I don't know," she said, shaking her head. "But I can't be here. I just can't." I walked over to her, placing my hand gently on her arm. "I'll give you money. It's not much, but it'll help. Please, just promise me you'll be safe." She nodded, her lips trembling. "I will. I don't want to be here anymore." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the little I had saved, just a few bills, but enough for a bus ticket, a room for the night. "Take this," I said, pressing it into her hand. "And go. Please. Just go." She stared at the money for a long time, and then, with a soft, shaky breath, she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you for everything." I watched her leave, the door closing behind her with a finality that made my heart ache. I didn't know what would happen next, where she would go, or what she would face in the days ahead. But I knew she was free, free from the house, from Mr. Johnson's suffocating grip, free from the nightmare she had been living for so long. The weight in my chest lightened just a little as I stood there, knowing that, for once, she had made a choice that would change her life forever. That brings us to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.